how did they make armies of these nice-chested orcs walk across Middle-earth? How? This is crazy computer CGI imagery. Well, it's not this. You could hire an army of artists to puppeteer an orc, or you could hire thousands of nicely chested extras, but then you have to build costumes for them or teach them how to fight. That's not very useful. So in computer science, we have this process, this method called procedural generation. And it's a method of using math to generate content. So by way of demonstration, I'm going to break a Ignite SF rule to not walk around. So I want you guys to put one of your hands up and point at me. Just come on, just do it for me. Just keep pointing at me, and yeah, just keep pointing at me while I walk around. Cool. So what this is doing, and I'm using you. I just wrote code now, and I used you to execute the code to generate something procedurally. And what that is basically every entity, you guys, or one of these programmed entities, is generating or using a really simple instruction to create something else, something more. So that can be extrapolated into, for example, schools of fish, where you have each fish is following some simple instructions of avoiding each other, aligning with each other, looking for food, avoiding prey, and you create some really interesting structures. So it's not infallible. Procedural generation is not. I worked on this ad for Nike, and I was generating thousands of animations, little particles flying around someone's head as they're thinking about equations and math and so on. And inevitably, one of these particles flew in front of the actor's face. And the art director told me, hey, you got to get rid of that particle. It doesn't look very good. And I told him, I can't, because I'm generating a swarm. I have to start all over. And that's just how it works. And a colleague of mine gave me a really good analogy. It's like, I'm not programming a computer. I'm teaching an animal how to perform tricks. In the best case scenario, it does something really neat. In the worst case scenario, it bites your head off. So, procedural generation can also be used to create forms and textures and geometry. So for example, this is a piece that I did for Google, in which case I used a procedural generation technique to create a spiral galaxy using particles and textures. And this is a piece by Michael Hansmeyer, and this is using fractals in geometry manipulation operations to create architecture. And he's using this to 3D print these amazing pillars that eventually comes out into real life. So I moonlight as a game developer, and one of the games that I'm making is a city simulator. And for a city simulator, you have to have thousands and thousands of buildings, and I can't possibly make that many. So for insight for my thought process on how to create buildings, this is it. I'm going to geek out a little bit, right? So as an architect, you need a blueprint, an outline to create a building. And so you can imagine extruding this outline to create a very, very simple building. It's kind of boring, it's kind of flat. So we're going to make it more interesting now. So every time we extrude, we randomly delete a tile out of this building. And slowly and steadily, it starts creating more and more shape and form. And we can apply different operations to the base shape every time. So now, back to this 2D shape on the far left, you can imagine how we're modifying this 2D shape by clipping it, right? We can add to it or subtract from it, and it creates more variety and more detail. And from my reference material, this is a photograph from Manhattan. A lot of the buildings staircase on one side and they're flush on the other. So to mimic this, I would take all of the 2D shapes and I would push them to one side, thereby creating a very, very similar look to that. On top of that, you can also rotate each iteration. So you can imagine things like the Burj Dubai or the Sydney Opera House emerging from processes such as this. And you start getting some more realistic looking buildings, for example, building out like rooftop structures, right? So in order to build a roof, what do? Well, you take the base shape, you reduce it a little bit, and you cut a hole using that shape, or maybe you would just add on top of that. So by adding these little details, we make it slightly more recognizable, slightly more building-like. And so by shoving a random number generator through all of these properties, what we get is an incredible variety of forms and shapes that may or may not look like real buildings, but I don't care, it looks really, really cool. So the takeaway I want is that next time you see an orc with a really nice chest far in the distance and they're fighting and there's thousands of them, think of procedural generation as a method on how they're made, and maybe you can gain some new insight about that. So thank you very much.